away after that.
Cool.
All right. So for our guests, there are a couple more of you guys who RSVP'd, so maybe some will show up as we get started here. But thank you guys for coming to the first Faculty Friday of the 23-24 academic year. We have Professor Tim Johnson, who's been a professor here at the U for over 20 years, after having taught at the Southern Illinois University after he got his PhD at Washington University in St. Louis. It's getting all that mixed up. So he teaches a bunch of classes, namely the undergraduate courses that he teaches are American Democracy in a Changing World, Justice in America, Constitutional Law, Civil Liberties, Criminal Rights, and Law and Film, all of which are very popular. So if you guys haven't taken those or signed up for them, something to keep your eye out for. He has published more than 45 articles and book chapters, as well as 6 books of his own, including The Logic of American Politics and A Good Quarrel. America's top legal reporters share stories from inside the Supreme Court. His works have been covered by the likes of the Wall Street Journal, and as well as NPR, USA Today, and ABC, just to name a few, and The Economist. In addition to his many successes in research and scholarship, he is passionate about teaching and the success of his students in and out of the classroom. He was a semi-finalist for the prestigious Robert F. Cherry Award for Great Teaching and received the American Political Science Association's Distinguished Teaching Award. Continuing in student investment, he volunteered to give this talk today. And so with that, I will pass it on to him to kick things off.
Thanks, Corey. Blowing up my ego on a Friday afternoon. I really appreciate that. It's very kind of you. Mitchell, Mariella, Nick, it's good to see you all. Amina and Manashri, it's good to have you in the room as well. These are sort of informal meetings, and I will try not to talk a lot about the courts, especially given that Mitchell and Mariella are currently in classes of mine, and Nick has taken all of mine. But what I do want to talk about is what it's like to be a professor, right? So that's one of the things, right? You see us teaching you all, you might meet with us in our offices, you might be forced from time to time to read some of our research, but what really is it to be a professor? And so I'll talk just a little bit about my background and a little bit about being a professor, and then I'll really open it up for questions, and those may last all the way till noon or they may not, but I really want this to be a forum where, especially if you all are interested in becoming an academic at some point in your lives, whether that's in a law school, if you end up going to law school, or whether it's in a political science or sociology department, or maybe you're actually interested in something else and you want to be a biologist or a chemist or an engineer. All of them have pathways that can lead you into academia. So my path was not one that I thought would take me to academia. I was the type A personality who thought I was going to law school. I thought I would either spend my career in law or in politics. But I also wasn't the typical person to do either of those career paths. I grew up in what I really do consider a blue collar household. My dad was a teacher, but not in the white collar way. He was the gritty, rough and tumble social studies teacher in my high school for 35 years. And my mom had been a teacher earlier in her career, but was mostly a stay-at-home parent. And so we lived in a blue-collar town in southeastern Wisconsin, and I was lucky enough to have teachers who really took the time to mentor me and mentor folks who are around me. In fact, I'll say that 2 of my closest friends from high school are both political scientists. They both have PhDs. One of them left the profession and he now is a lawyer, but the other is a professor in Michigan. And so there were people who came from this small town in Wisconsin because we had such good mentors in our high school that we were able to go to good colleges and universities and then parlay that into going to graduate school. So I went to college in the last year of the 1980s. 1989 is when I began. I was a political science major, and that was mostly because I found the professors in that department, a very small department. There were only 6 professors, maybe 5, much more hands-on than other professors around the college that I was at. I went to Gustavus down the road in St. Peter here in Minnesota. And then I parlayed that a second time into going to graduate school. And you should know that people are successful and also not successful. I got into exactly one graduate school. And again, even in college, I was a type A personality. I had great grades. I don't test very well. And so I didn't do very well on the GREs, or at least I did mediocre on the GREs. But through contacts and through my advisor as an undergrad, I was able to get into WashU in St. Louis, which is a top 10 political science department. That's one bit of advice that you all need to keep in mind. And it's often who you know and not always what you know. And so that helped me. And I ended up being lucky enough, and both Nick and Marielle and Mitch will know for sure this name, Lee Epstein, because you've read stuff from her or you're using her textbook. She ended up being my mentor. For some reason, she saw something in me that she thought clicked, and she took me under her wing. And that's really history at that point. I started studying the court. I actually wasn't sure I was going to study the court. My other major as an undergraduate was Russian studies, and I don't speak very much Russian anymore. And that's because it's been 30 years since I stopped speaking Russian on a daily basis, and I just don't have people around me to speak Russian with anymore. But I actually went to graduate school to study Central Europe and Eastern Europe because they were transitioning to democracy, right? The wall in Berlin fell and the Soviet bloc fell in the early 1990s, late 1980s, and I wanted to be a part of that. So I went to work with someone else in graduate school. It didn't work out. He was not awesome to work with. I would have quit graduate school probably had I stayed with him. That's another piece of advice I can give you. You always need to find a good advisor and mentor who you can work with, whether it's in academia or in the law or whatever profession that you might pick. And so then when Lee Epstein took me under her wing, I started studying the law, something that I knew I always loved, but I didn't want to go to law school, even though that had been the plan all along. And by the time I was done with college, that had just fallen by the wayside. And so I spent 5 years in graduate school, studying the Supreme Court, learning every single thing that I could, empirically, historically, whatever angle it is. And then, as Corey said, I got my first job at Southern Illinois University. Go Salukis, if you know anything about Illinois. Southern Illinois had been a very, very good department for a long period of time in the 60s and the 70s. And then the state of Illinois decided that it didn't want Southern Illinois University to be the second of their state flagship schools after Champaign-Urbana anymore. And they started moving resources to Northern Illinois. But at that exact transition, SIU's political science department had bizarrely been able to hire 6 people who had all fallen through the cracks. One of them is actually in the poli-sci department here, Paul Gorin, who had been the chair of our department for the past 6 years. And all of those people were hired in the same time frame I was, between 1998 and 2000. And by 2004, all of them had left because the university didn't want to support us, couldn't support our research, was losing money by the bucketfuls probably every hour of every single day. And so we all scattered. And I was lucky enough to get a job at Minnesota. My wife and I have always wanted to live back in the Twin Cities. Neither of us are from here, but we both went to college in the area. We both have family here. And so we ended up back here. And while we have had chances to leave, we have not wanted to, because we found the Twin Cities and the department and the college and the university to be exactly sort of what we want. Not to mention my wife has her own career, and it wasn't something that she wanted to leave either. So that's sort of like the personal background. The real question then is, right, what is it to be a professor? And I will tell you this, and I hope you believe me when I say this, and I think you should believe me, that it is just a job, right? People have asked my wife over the years since I got my PhD 25 years ago, what's it like to live with someone who has a doctorate? And her response is always the exact same. He's the same dumb guy I married in 1993. He just happens to have a few letters after his name. And she's absolutely right about that, right? I have all the same quirks as anybody else who would be a lawyer or a doctor or a chef or a musician or a welder. You all know when you take my classes that I'm a big sucker for NFL football, the Green Bay Packers in particular. I'm a big sports junkie. I spend all my time with my boys beyond that and with my wife. And I just happen to be really good at studying the politics of law. I happen to be a very good writer. And I happen to, it turns out, be a pretty decent teacher. And so I have figured out a career that I absolutely love. And that's what you need to do as well. And that, again, could be in academia, it might not be. So let me just give you very quick nitty gritty on what professors actually do, right? We don't just stand in front of your class and teach you about topics that interest us or topics that you need to learn about. The University of Minnesota is what's known as an R1 or Research 1 university. And so my job is actually 50% research. So when I was hired by the department 23 years ago, the contract, which I'm still under now that I have tenure, is 50% research, 40% teaching, 10% service. And that service is providing committee work to the department, to the college, to the university, and even to the profession. And sometimes I spend more than 10% of my time doing those things because committee meetings can often take long periods of time. And as you all probably know, bureaucracy is awful most of the time. But I spend my time writing. I don't write alone anymore. I always write with co-authors. We come up with ideas, and those ideas are very similar to the way that ideas are ginned up in most people's lives. Over phone calls, over dinners, over beers in the bar, during trips. And we come up with ideas and we figure out ways that we would like to answer questions about law and politics in the United States. And then we produce a series of papers. And I'll tell you, there were a lot of people who thought COVID for academia was really, really bad. It turned out to be really good for me. And I was lucky enough that our kids were old enough that we didn't have to spend every minute of every day with them when COVID hit in the spring of 2020. But I was more productive during that time than I had been probably the previous 4 years in my career, because I would just be on the phone or on Zoom on a regular basis with friends of mine around the country in academia, and we would gin up ideas. And then we would write a paper and we would go ahead and try to get them published. So I do that. And then I spend a lot of time with you all. I know I spend more time than 50% of my time. I think I spend more time working on teaching and mentoring and advising students than I do doing research. But that's because even at an R1 university, teaching is in my blood. I already told you my dad was a teacher. My grandma was a teacher. One of my brothers is a teacher. I have teachers all over my family. And so it always seemed to me that that was a great way to give back to society and community. And that is teaching others, in this case, about government and how our government works. And so that's what I do. I'm not always in the office. You all know that you can often get a hold of me over Zoom. You know that you can set up appointments with me, but in 2023, I don't need to be in the office to get research done. In fact, I don't need to be in the office to get teaching lectures written or classes taken care of, and unless I need to be there in person teaching for you all in front of class. And so it's a Friday and I'm at home and I'm doing work, and my wife and I are both going to work for 5 or 6 hours, and then we're going to go off and do the rest of the stuff we need to do for the day. But the key is I get things done because we have figured out, and this is maybe the last piece of advice I'll give before I'll take questions from you all, and that is no matter what you do in life, no matter what you choose to do, and academia is a really good choice of what to do because there's a lot of freedom in this particular profession, is you have to have a work-life balance. I turn off at about 3 o'clock every day. I'm up early. You all who take my 8:15 classes know that I'm in the office before 6 a.m. every morning before class. I'm usually up at 4:30, 4:45 at the latest. And I get a lot done in the morning, and then my mind just goes to mush by 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And that is how I achieve work-life balance, because it turns to mush. I do other things that don't involve me having to think about what I'm doing as a political scientist at that point. So at any rate, that's what I do. And as Corey pointed out, I study courts, for those of you who haven't taken classes from me. And I, in particular, study the U.S. Supreme Court. And I think maybe I'll leave it at that. Just so if you all have questions about what I do or about what I study or how I accomplish any of those things, I'd love to answer any and all of those questions that you have for the rest of the time we're together.
Kind of piggybacking off of your talk about careers.
Yeah.
I guess in particular to the US Supreme Court class that I'm taking, besides law school, what kind of careers could that kind of prep you for? Because I love the class, but I don't want to go to law school. So like kind of what are my options to further pursue that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that there are a number of things that you can do, Mitchell, right? You can, I was just actually in contact with 2 different state Supreme Court's information offices. And so you can get jobs working. Let's say that you're interested in marketing, for instance. One of our sons is in college working on a marketing degree. You could actually go and work for an information office. And that is a place where you would supply information about decisions a court makes here in Minnesota or in any state court around the country. So you could do that. You could use it to go into law enforcement, right? So you're learning enough about the law that you start learning the judicial process. And that could, lead to you saying, I want to get into law in some way that is not being a lawyer. My big spiel about a political science major, and that the 3,000 level course that you're in right now, Mitchell, is a little difficult because it is a lecture course, right? So you're not doing a lot of writing. The class that Mariella is in and those that Nick has taken, there's a lot more writing in those, and there's a lot more critical thinking, although I think there's pretty good amounts of critical thinking in the 3309 class as well. Here's my shtick about why I think you should be a political science major. And if you don't want to be in political science, why you should be in the College of Liberal Arts. We have this notion in this day and age, and I'll come back to specifics for your question, Mitchell, but this is the general argument that I always make. We have this argument today that students don't need to do the liberal arts, that they are in some sense worthless, that you need to know what to do before you go out into the world. So you have to have a marketing degree, or you have to have a finance degree, or you have to have a degree that you can be hands-on in some way, shape, or form. But what the liberal arts do, and what I think we do best at Minnesota in the political science department in CLA, is we give you 3 tools. One is we teach you how to think critically. Second is we teach you how to write really well. We've got a lot of writing intensive courses. And in fact, we have a lot of professors who are really, really, really good at teaching writing. And then the other is that we teach you how to be able to speak orally and make good cogent arguments on your feet. Now, again, not in the big lecture class, but that will come when I hope you take my other courses, Mitchell, and others as well. And Mariella can attest to this, right? In 4501 right now, I quite literally force the students to speak. And this is the first semester I've done it. The participation grade is 30% of your grade in that class. And Mariella might roll her eyes at me, but at 8:15 in the morning, her hand is still up in the air and she's answering questions and pushing back against things that other students say and pushing back against things that I say or questioning whatever the court might have done. And so you get those skills: critical thinking, writing well, being able to think quickly on your feet to make arguments orally. Then when you go out and get a job, they can teach you all the specific skills for that job, whether it's being a police officer, whether it's being a court information officer, whether it's working in politics, whatever it might be. These skills that we are giving you in these courses you are taking go so far beyond the substantive content of those courses that you're going to come out, right? You're going to have this piece of paper that says you've got a degree from the University of Minnesota. That means a lot. And despite what people say, it means a whole hell of a lot beyond the state boundaries of the state of Minnesota. You are at one of the best public universities in the country, if not the entire world. And that degree in CLA with these skills that I'm hoping I in particular, and I know my colleagues as well, do as well or better than I do, will help you in the world. So does that help, Mitchell? Good. Manushri, I didn't realize you were there as well until you turned on your camera. Good to see you as well. What other questions do you all have?
I'm going to have a couple.
Yeah, go for it, Nick.
First of all, I want to really agree with what you said about developing skills. And I use myself as an example. What I ended up doing professionally had nothing to do with my bachelor's or master's, but I had developed skills in the process that enabled me to switch professions, enabled me to think critically, to write, to read. The words don't come to mind, but read in depth.
Yeah. Yeah.
Critically, that's the word I'm looking for.
Yeah.
And I don't feel that any education is wasted. I sense a tendency now for people to go to school for a degree in like STEM that hopefully will lead directly into a job and such. And I find it unfortunate that there isn't much more focus on the other benefits of an education. Yeah, it's not a trade school.
Right. And I think that's the point that I want to drive home about CLA, but in particular, just because I'm biased about political science, right? We want good thinking citizens. And I said this, I work with a group of high school teachers who teach our Introduction to American Politics class. Those of you who are from Minnesota might know the College in the Schools program. So they teach our class in the high school, and then the students get credit for 1001. And we had our quarterly meeting the other day. And I was telling them that the data show that folks who take civics, and the state legislature just passed a law that says that starting in, I don't know if it's 25 or 26, that all graduating high school students now are required to take a civics class. And the data actually show that all of this idea that we have lost so much trust in government, and government has lost so much legitimacy, that when people learn about government and learn how things work, again, as a political science major, but even in high school, just in a civics or a political science class there, that their levels of trust and their feelings of legitimacy in the government actually increase, because they understand how things work, and they don't have to rely on news sources that might not be good. They don't have to rely on their friends who might be spinning conspiracy theories. It really is just helpful for democracy in general. And that's the normative statement I would make about this to add on to what you said, Nick. That is, it just this idea of being able to think critically, but also understand how things work, really change people's minds about the way the world works. And it's not that we want to change your mind. And I hope folks who take my class can attest to this. You all don't know my ideology. You don't know my beliefs. It is not my job to tell you what to think. It's not my job to tell you what to believe. But what it is my job to do is to teach you how to think critically, so that you can figure out whether what you do believe and what your ideology is appropriate for your place in the world. So what else?
If nobody else has something, I wanted to ask you, what do you see as being the relative merits of in-person classes versus Zoom classes?
1,000% better, 10,000% better, 100,000% better. Corey listed off teaching awards that I've won, and I love that, and I think it's great, and it's a testament to, for me personally, to how much I care about teaching. But I will tell you all that I was almost no different than any other professor or teacher in this country in March of 2020. I got the worst teaching evaluations that I've ever had. And part of that was that I just shut down, right? The world shut down. I shut down. I shut down mentally. I shut down physically. In those classes, I pretty much recorded all of my lectures, so it was asynchronous, sent them out to the students and said, listen to the lectures, here are the quizzes, here are the exams. If you have any questions, email me. Because really things probably just should have been shut down, but we couldn't do that. But everybody, I think, just had such a problem with it. And I realized that that wasn't sustainable. And so I obviously revamped everything in the fall of 2021, even though it was asynchronous, or even though it was on Zoom. And then I did things synchronously. But, and no offense to those who don't have your camera on right now, it is really difficult to teach to yourself. But it is equally as difficult, as I'm looking right now. I don't mean to embarrass you, but Manushree, I was just looking at you and I said this, like, I don't know if you're actually looking at me or you're reading email or text. And I know you're probably not, but like, it's really hard to tell. And I know I'm sitting in class and Mitchell, I'm telling you guys, is always on his phone. He's always doing stuff. He's never listening. No, I'm just kidding, Mitchell. But like, you can tell, right? When students, even if you are multitasking in my class, if you have your laptop up or your phone buzzes, so you look at it quickly, I know you're engaged in things. And just, there is something about a physical connection. And you all would know that in your personal lives, but the same thing goes for teaching. There's there's nothing personal about what we are doing here, right? I mean, you all can ask questions, I can answer, I can tell, what I think are good anecdotes. You might roll your eyes at them, but there is literally distance between us, and I don't like that distance. It was hard enough to teach with masks on for that first semester we were back. And I think everybody, no pun intended, but breathed a sigh of relief when masks were able to be removed and we had all of the air purifiers in the classrooms. We continued to stay socially distant, but we were together. And so, Nick, I think there is just no comparison. If I were forced tomorrow, right, if Corey were the dictator of the world and he said, I just like Zoom and everybody's going to teach on Zoom, I would do it because I still think there's merit in providing information or providing education to people. But there's something beyond the education that you all would be getting, or that you are getting, that you experience when you're in a classroom together. So, I mean, that might sound like I am all duckies and bunnies, or that I'm a Hallmark Christmas movie or a holiday movie by saying that, but that's really, I mean, that's how passionate I am about teaching. I really want to be in direct contact with my students.
Wholeheartedly agreed. I think another factor is there's a lot more discussion among students in in-person classes.
Oh yeah, nobody wants to talk over Zoom. Honest to goodness. I don't know how many professors for you all had breakout rooms. For one, I never learned how to actually do breakout rooms, but I also am not certain. I mean, I guess I know how to do them. It's just a pain in the neck, but I'm also not certain that they're incredibly useful because people don't want to talk. I mean, it's hard enough to get you all to talk in the classroom. It's really difficult to talk over a computer, and it's different when you're with your friend, right? I am more than willing to Zoom with one of my best friends who lives right now on the other side of the world, because that is the only way that he and I can be in contact. And so that is better than nothing. And I suppose teaching in front of a class is better, or in front of Zoom, in front of this camera, is better than nothing. But it's far, far, far inferior to being in person. All right, who else has something?
You mentioned working on research. Are there any projects you're working on right now, and what does it look like?
Yeah. So I'm working on a number of projects. So let's see. The one that might be most interesting to you all is, you would note that there's a lot, but in the court that we would care about most, the U.S. Supreme Court, because it sets policy for the whole country, is a court that doesn't have cameras in front of it. And the justices have been reticent and, in fact, downright stubborn, to the extent that they will not allow cameras in the courtroom. They're allowing real time, right? You can live stream, if you weren't in my classes, from 8:15 till 9:30, although I guess you can turn them on at 9:30 on Monday, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays. They're live streaming their arguments, just the audio. They record their arguments and then archive them, but they draw the line at putting cameras in the courtroom because they believe that they will be soundbited, right? So a justice asks a question that makes them sound snarky or mean or whatever it might be, and that's what would make the nightly news, or would make Fox or CNN or whatever the news outlet would be. So some colleagues of mine and I around the country have been quite interested in all right, let's see what happens. If you actually have cameras in a courtroom, does it harm a court's legitimacy? And so we went and we found clips from a couple of state Supreme Courts. The ones we are using are Minnesota and Indiana, for a variety of reasons. They're very similar courts. They're both in the Midwest. They're not very diverse, either gender-wise or ethnically or racially. And so we were able to, which normatively is not a good thing, but for the purposes of an experiment, it keeps things the same, which you want to do when you're making comparisons. And then we were able to pick what we call a nice exchange or a neutral exchange, where one of the judges just asks an attorney a question and then the attorney answers, versus another clip where a judge actually gets angry, or what we define as nasty, and then how that exchange works. And we show respondents, we have a national sample, we showed respondents these clips, and then we got their responses on things like, how much do they trust the judiciary? How much do they think the judiciary is legitimate? And a whole battery of other questions. And it turns out that when people see neutral exchanges, they actually think courts are highly legitimate, and that legitimacy and trust factor takes a minor hit when it comes to seeing like sort of a crabby judge asking questions. So we are trying to figure out ways to extend that research, but the bottom line is we're trying to figure out whether cameras are good or bad to have in courtrooms. So that's one that I'm really interested in. Another that has been a long-term project, Nick worked on this project and many other students did as well. Mitchell, I'll get to this in a few weeks. The one sort of uncharted territory of the Supreme Court's decision-making process, where scholars have not been able to analyze what the justices do, is their conference discussions. And the reason this is the case is the conference discussions are completely private. Nobody is in that room except the 9 justices. And so there's really no way to analyze how, when they have a discussion about, think about how Dobbs was decided or some other salient case recently decided, we have no way to understand how that discussion affects the decisions the justices make. But we know from psychology and sociology and economics and a whole bunch of other literatures that having a discussion like this can actually change people's views. Like if I spent this entire hour talking about how amazing law school was, maybe I would change Mitchell's mind or someone else's mind, and they would say, oh, maybe I will go to law school because Tim says it's so darn amazing to do so, right? The bottom line is conversation, you can persuade people. So my best friend, some of you have read stuff from him. His name is Ryan Black. He's a professor at Michigan State. He was an undergrad here at Minnesota. His degree is from 2004. He also has a PhD from Washington University in St. Louis from around 2009, 2010. He and I got $400,000 from the National Science Foundation. It's been 6 years since we got it. And we went to the Library of Congress and several archives around the country where former justices left their papers. And we found that the justices, almost to a person, kept notes during those conference discussions. And so we went and took digital images of all the notes. And we spent the first 4 years having people transcribe those notes for us, because like doctors, justices' notes and handwriting are really terrible. Some of you have seen these notes before, and others of you in my classes right now will see them soon. And so we are now in the process of finishing cleaning those transcriptions, which turned out to be pretty good. The people who coded for us, we probably had about 1,200 people code 35,000 images over the course of those 4 years. And now we have a very small cadre, a very small team of people that I'm leading that are cleaning them to make sure that the transcriptions are as accurate as humanly possible. And then we will analyze those across time. We currently have notes from all the way back to 1936, going all the way up through 1994. We're going to add some more recent ones, and we're going to analyze how these very private discussions the justices have affect the decisions they make. So those are the 2 big projects. And I'll just say very quickly about one other project. 2 of my former graduate students and I came up with this idea, and we wrote a paper a couple of years ago, right after COVID, where we were trying to assess how the media reacted to the Supreme Court flipping to live streaming its oral arguments, because the first time it ever live streamed was in May of 2020, and it did so because it closed the courtroom. And so the public couldn't get there. And we found some interesting findings. We tried to get the paper published. Reviews came back and said either it was too short or there was other things you needed to answer. And so we actually were contacted by a press, Rowman and Littlefield, in, I think, December of 2021, and they asked us for a book. And so we wrote a short book on the media's reaction to the COVID crisis at the US Supreme Court. And this is the fastest I've ever written. And it's a short book. It's only about 180 pages. We produced that book in 8 months. For Rowman and Littlefield, and it came out, I think, in like June or July or something like that of this year. But it was the fastest I've ever written. So those are 3 of the big projects that I've done recently.
Do you have a favorite class to teach or a class that you recommend everyone take?
Yeah, so I mean, yours for sure. 3309, which is no longer called, I think, Corey, we changed the name, and I think it's now called Supreme Court process instead of judicial process, because long ago I got bored enough with state Supreme Courts and with lower federal courts that I don't talk about them much anymore. I talk about them a little bit from time to time, but it's mostly about the Supreme Court. And I love the common law classes because I love reading the cases and helping students analyze them and have them prepare for law school if that's where they're going. But absolutely, I think 3309 might be my favorite because, and you've heard me say this, Mitchell, I beat the class over the head with this. Very few people understand how the Supreme Court works because everything about it is so opaque. It's all done privately. And so to be able to open it up, and you're going to see this starting on Tuesday when I get into the internal decision-making process of the justices, you're going to learn things and you're going to see data and you're going to see archival images that nobody sees because we just don't think about how the court works. We just, turn on the news or flip on Twitter or Instagram at the end of June, and we see the high court hand down all these decisions that affect all of our lives on a daily basis, but we don't know how it works. So I'm a complete sucker for teaching people about the Supreme Court. And I hope that comes across in the class. I mean, that is my absolute favorite class in terms of just that part of the process. But I will say, Corey mentioned film and law 3311, which is now no longer a class that is, I guess it was a standalone class, if you will. We actually got it fully approved by the College of Liberal Arts. I only teach it currently in the May session, and I've told myself probably for a decade I was going to no longer teach in the May session, but I haven't figured out how to teach law and film in a 16-week semester yet. I think I can figure it out, but I also don't want to teach night classes. It would really have to be a 3-hour night class once a week. Law and film, I love because I love films. They're all fiction, right? They're not, none of the films that I show in this class are nonfiction. They're all Hollywood films about some aspect of law. Think To Kill a Mockingbird, right? That's one of the movies we watch in that class. I love teaching that class because not only does it allow students, you all to watch classic movies that most of you have never heard of or seen before, but it allows us to talk about the law, and it allows me with students to talk about the law in a different way than I do in any of these classes. In the end, this is going to be a cop-out. I love all the classes I teach, but I think 3309 is by far my favorite just because I get to share my passion with the students. Who else?
I have a quick question. I haven't taken 3309, but that was one of the reasons why I wanted to attend this, is I've heard it mentioned in a couple of other classes and just want to get a chance to meet you. But I was able to snag a couple of tickets for Amy Coney Barrett coming up here next week. What should we listen for as she speaks? I also heard Liz Cheney speak a couple of nights ago, but what should we listen for coming from Amy Coney Barrett?
Look, what you're going to hear is the party line, and I don't mean that in a partisan way. I actually mean you're going to hear the party line from the Supreme Court. And so this is not me trying to big time anyone, but it's to make the point that I want to make. So I've seen Justices Kavanaugh, Sotomayor, Kagan, Roberts, Scalia, Ginsburg, O'Connor. There might be one or two others give talks. Almost all at the University of Minnesota, a few other places, some in small, more intimate settings, some in Northrop, where you or others who have tickets will see her next week. And the party line on the Supreme Court that you're going to want to listen for, and you can believe or not believe, Kirk, is that everything at the court is peachy keen. Everybody gets along. All the decisions are about the law. There is no controversy within the court. She will not, even though every justice who comes here will take questions from the audience, but they're picky about which ones they will answer, right? So if somebody were to walk up to the microphone and say, tell me about the ethics scandal that's going on at the court, she's not going to answer that question. And it's not because it's Justice Coney Barrett. if you put any of the 9 up there, they're not going to answer that question, because this is something that they're working through internally right now, and they're not going to make any public statements, because as any individual justice, she doesn't speak for the court, right? She only speaks for herself. But I would listen for what she has to say about how the justices do interact, because she in fact might say, yes, there has been some tension here or there. So if she gives any indication that not everything is peachy keen and perfect at the court, then you're sort of thinking that I'm thinking that she's going down the track of being more open than a justice normally would. And I don't think that the justices are lying to us. I don't think they're trying to pull the wool over our eyes, but their job is not to make us feel good about what they are doing. Their job is to do their job. But what the other part of the job is, they need to make sure that we as the public want to listen to them. And with the hits that the court's legitimacy has taken over the past 6 to 9 to 12 to 24 months, and maybe a little bit more than that, when the justices go out and give talks like this, their main job is to make us feel better about the court and feel like it is a legitimate institution. And I'll tell you this, political scientists have actually studied this effect, and people who go to these lectures always come back. If they fill out public opinion surveys, they always feel better about the Supreme Court than before they went in, because they just get a sense that you've got an actual human being sitting up there talking to you. In this realm, because I have students in this talk who are currently in my classes, I won't talk about my own beliefs and my own ideology. But whatever your beliefs or ideology, I think she will try to make it very clear that everything is a-okay at the court. So that's probably what you're listening for.
Okay. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah. And I hope you take a class sometime.
I will.
If you could give one piece of advice to undergrad students who are considering grad school, what would that be? Thank you.
Yep. It's going to sound like 2 pieces of advice, but it's the same. And Nick talked about it, I think. Read as much as humanly possible, and write as much as humanly possible. And so that's 2 instead of 1, but let me talk about the reading. It does not necessarily mean reading in the area that you want to study. Now, I think you should do that as well. Like if you're going to go to grad school and you know you want to study judicial politics, which is what I do, then you might want to go to someone, whether it's me or someone in the law school, or Professor Hilbink, who does comparative judicial politics, or others in the department or in the sociology department. Go and ask them, what are the big things you should read, right? What are the classic books, the classic articles? What are some cutting edge things that you should maybe take a look at over the course of your junior or senior year? But the other part is you should read for fun as well. I remember in every grad department, whether it's biology or political science, there will be some class you need to take on learning about the profession, to sort of like learn what it's like to become a professor. And I remember my class in particular, my professor who taught that was a really old guy at the time by the name of Bob Salisbury. You can Google him, very, very famous political scientist in the middle to late 20th century. The best part about Bob is he was about 6'3", and he looked exactly like Colonel Sanders from KFC. He even walked with a cane. And Bob walked into class one day and he said, "What are you all reading? Is anyone reading anything good?" And everybody raised their hands and they started saying these political science books and articles that they're reading. And he said, no. Is anyone reading anything for fun? And I don't do a lot of things right in my life. I could bring my wife into the room right now and she could tell you that, but she's working. But what I do right is I was the only one to raise my hand when he said, "Is anybody reading anything fun?" I am a sucker for really trashy crime novels. So I'm a big John Grisham fan. I'm a big Scott Turow fan. I'm a big fan of folks who just sort of mass produce crime novels or law novels, whatever they might be. Here's the reason you read a lot. The more you read, the better you'll write. Because when you read good writers, and I actually consider John Grisham a pretty good writer, you will learn what it is like to write well. because you're reading good writing. Now, that also means, right, some highbrow literature as well, whatever that might be, whether it's Virginia Woolf or somebody else. I'm not a Virginia Woolf fan. Her name just came to mind. Or not a fan, I just don't read a lot of her stuff, but her name came to mind. But the more you read, the better you're going to write. And I can tell you this, even though it's anecdotally, I can tell you it's empirically true. We have 3 sons. 2 of them don't like to read. 1 always has a book in his hand. He's the best writer of the 3. And it's only because, not only, I mean, the kid is pretty darn smart, but I think it's partially because he is always, always reading. So read a lot, write a lot. And then take classes. You only asked for 1, Amina, but there's 3. I'll go back to what I said earlier. Take classes that will force you to think critically, so your mind is always on and your mind is always working to solve problems. Those will get you far in graduate school. We good? Oh, no,
Question.
go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
What would you say is the best way to prepare for law school besides taking classes that you're interested in?
That's it. Right. And let me be very clear about this. Someone with a music major or an engineering major is equally as likely to get into law school as someone who takes all of the quote unquote right law classes and right political science classes that would lead you down that path. Why? I've got friends who are musicians. I think I mentioned that my mom was a musician. She was a professional cellist for most of her life. Music is a language, right? And so if you're learning that language, that's helping you think critically as you are either doing music theory or you're thinking critically about how to play your part in a symphony or in whatever thing you're doing. And it would be the same in bio or chem or engineering or physics, whatever it is. Law schools actually want, and this is going to sound strange, but I'm going to say it, despite what the Supreme Court said, law schools want diversity. And that doesn't just mean diversity of gender and race and ethnicity and religion. What it means is they want diversity of thought. So they are likely, if you are from Minnesota, if you are from International Falls, Minnesota, you are not as likely, but you're pretty darn likely to get into an Ivy League school if you have the same test scores as someone who is actually from Washington, D.C. and whose parents are legacies. And people don't buy those data. And it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean anything about what I think about affirmative action. I'll give you just one idea about my ideology. I'm a huge fan of affirmative action. That's a discussion for another day. But my point is, law schools want diversity of idea, and that goes to actually your academic program as an undergrad. They want diversity of people. They don't just want the me or you Manushree who knew from 3 years old that we were going to go to law school and we were going to be the best law student. They want someone who's thought about the world in different ways, who has perhaps traveled internationally, who has perhaps had a job for a couple of years after undergraduate, and then you've got experience. If you're going to law school, but you're not sure you're ready, here's another way that you can almost guarantee a spot at any great law school. Go out and work in politics for a couple of years, go and work in the legal world for a couple of years. And yes, there are jobs in the legal world where you don't have to be a lawyer. That experience, and then you being 25 instead of 22 or 26 instead of 22, makes admissions counselors in law school look at you in a much different light than a 21, 22-year-old. It doesn't mean it's impossible to get in. People go to law school every day right out of college. But my point is, there's all sorts of things you can do that are not what are seen as, and I'll again put it in air quotes, as the normal path and the best path you should take to go to law school. Do what you love, have passion about it, work your butt off to be successful at it. And the admissions counselors are going to see that, and they're going to know that you're the type of person who can do really well at the law. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question about research.
Yeah.
I feel like we have a lot of first generation students in CLA. And so how do you figure out a professor that like you want to do research under, and how do you go about asking them whether it's independent study or research? Like, how does that usually work in higher education?
Yeah, it's a terrible question for you, Mariella, because you've already taken care of that, right? I mean, you and I have already had that discussion a little bit. No, I'm just kidding. But we have had that discussion. I think it really does start with something you're passionate about, right? So if you came to me and said, I want to do research about courts, but I'm actually interested in courts in Brazil, I'm going to say, all right, I can help you with the court stuff, but you've got to go down the hall and talk to Professor Hillbank, because she's actually not only an expert on comparative courts, but an expert on Latin American and South American courts in particular. And she's a really freaking terrific professor and advisor. And so I think what you do, you go back to the adage that I used earlier, and it's partly about who you know. And so you can come to me or any of your professors, whether it's in political science or any other department, and say, I really want to do research. Here's what I'm interested in particular. Do you do this, or does one of your colleagues or somebody else around the college do it? And if they do, can you help me try to get an in with them? And I think it really just starts by being, if you want to get down to brass tacks, Mariella, it comes down to being an active participant in class, right? So from the get-go, if you are asking questions, if you are engaged, if you come up after class and talk to a professor, if you ask to come to their office hours, if you're writing them emails, I promise you, you're not going to be annoying anybody. You've all met the professor who's going to be or who is annoyed when you act in that way. Anyone who's worth their weight of being a professor will not be annoyed by that. They will be absolutely positively impressed. And let me give you the quintessential example. Although I can't bring her on Zoom here because she's currently on, apparently her college has fall break. So she's at Disney with her family. But this was an undergrad of mine who ended up being a graduate student of mine. And after about the 5th day in, and I mean this sincerely, Intro to US Politics, that Poli-Sci 1001, I asked Amanda to stay after class, and she actually thought she was in trouble. And I said, why are you in Intro to American Government? Because you're clearly a senior in college at the U. And she said, oh, no, I'm only in my first, or no, she was in her 2nd semester as a freshman. And I didn't believe her, right? Because of the types of questions she was asking and how engaged she was. And I, on the spot, said, you need to come to my office, or make an appointment to come to my office in the next couple of weeks. And we need to talk about you getting on as being a research assistant, or to start doing your own research. So the starting point, and she did, she loved it. She went to grad school. She became a professor, right? And she could have done anything else, but that's what she chose to do. So in the end, right, find those contacts, but the way you're going to find them is in class. Make those professors know that this is something that you're passionate about. And I know that you and I, Mariella, are going to have more conversations about this in the near future. But once you let people know and you show that you care in class, they're going to come after you as well, because we're all looking for research assistants, and we're all looking for people who we can work with to help you achieve your own research that you want to conduct. And I'll put a plug in for the entire department. I only mentioned Professor Hillbank. This department, it's one of the reasons I haven't left, is so good at working with undergraduates, research-wise and beyond. If you ever go to the 14th floor, A, that's where my office is, and B, that's where the main offices are. When those elevators open up, all of our awards are on the wall. And yes, they're there to give us all an ego boost. But the thing you all should look at are the number of teaching awards that our department has won. And in our one university, that is unusual, because I'm supposed to blow you all off. I'm supposed to teach at the minimum for you all, and then conduct my research and produce millions of papers instead of just many dozens of papers over my career. And I should produce dozens of books instead of the 6 that I've written. And then that would be to the detriment of all of your education. And that's not the way I view the world. And it's not the way that the vast majority of folks in this department view the world. So if you ask, they will help, but make it easy for them to want to help by being that participant in class that makes it clear that you want to do more than just the classroom work. Well, thank you all. I really appreciate this. And yeah, hold on one second, Nick, and then I'll let you have your last question. Corey, thank you for doing this and letting me be the first. I know it was a small group, but you all asked really good questions, and it's really good to see some of you outside of class. So thank you for the questions and the comments, and it was good to spend some time with you on a late Friday morning. And the sun seems to finally maybe be coming out here in a little while, even though it's going to still be cold. Nick, go ahead. You get the last word.
If we have time. regarding the transcripts, now you said the conferences are very private.
Yep.
Just nine justices. So why are there notes available to the public?
Great question. Because the justices, so if you have memos or notes in 2023 emails in the White House, by federal law, those are public record. Okay. And they go right, either they go to a presidential archive or they go somewhere if they are, depending on who you are, they go someplace if they're marked classified. Supreme Court justices' papers are not considered public record. They are their own personal notes. So they are private and no one gets their hands on them until the justices let their papers out to the public. And many justices have decided that when they die, they want their papers in an archive for scholars to view. Hugo Black didn't believe that because he thought no one would care. So he actually, on his deathbed, asked his family to burn all of his papers from the Supreme Court. And they burned a whole bunch of them. And then they realized, oh my God, we're burning history. And they kept all the rest. So his files aren't all that good. But other justices, like Minnesota's own Harry Blackmun, was so anal retentive, he kept everything. And so his files are hundreds of thousands of pages long at the Library of Congress. But they would never be let out to the public without the former justice's permission. So because they are their own work product and not considered governmental work product, they stay private forever unless they let them out. And once they let them out, they become public record. So that's how we got our hands on them. And anybody can, any of you all sitting in this meeting, go to the Library of Congress manuscript room and you can see the papers of all sorts of former justices.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you for
all very
the
much.
presentation.
Fair enough. Yeah, not a problem. Thank you all. And Nick, we'll be in touch. I'm sure I'm going to talk to others of you in class in the coming weeks. And if you ever have questions, I'm going to throw up in the chat for those of you who are not in my class. Here's my email. I think I typed it correctly. You can also find me. If you're going to Google me, you have to Google Timothy R. Johnson because there's too damn many Tim Johnsons in this state and in this world. But Timothy R. Johnson will get you close to me. If you do Timothy R. Johnson political science, I will be the first one who comes up. Probably the only one.
Thank you for the piece of advice.
Not a problem. Thanks for the good questions. You all have a great Friday and a good weekend. And I'll see some of you soon.
Thank you for your time. Go Pack, go.
Go Pack.
Goodbye.
See y'all.